Today, we're going to dive into the unsolved disappearance of the Sodder children. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you're interested in all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. In 1945, the Sodder family, who reside in Fayetteville, West Virginia, was having a normal Christmas Eve. All 9 children, except the eldest, who was in the Army, were at home with their parents, Jenny and George. It had gotten late, and Jenny was getting ready to get the children to bed. 5 of the children asked for special permission to stay up. Maurice, who was 14, Martha, who was 12, Louise, who was 10, Jenny, who was 8, and Betty, who was 6. Jenny, their mother, said that they could stay up later, but they had to do a couple chores before they went to bed. This included taking care of the farm animals, turning the lights off, shutting the curtains, and of course, locking the front door. After she gave them the list of chores, Jenny and George and the other children went up to bed, and their eldest daughter fell asleep on the couch. In the early mornings of Christmas Day in 1945, the phone would wake Jenny from her sleep. She crawled out of bed quietly as to not disturb George and the baby and went to the hallway where she answered the phone. When she answered, a woman was on the phone and she could hear several people talking in the background. The anonymous caller asked Jenny for a person that she didn't know. Of course, Jenny said that she had the wrong number and that she didn't know that person. The woman kind of laughed strangely and then just hung up the phone. And of course, Jenny thought that was super strange and quite a bit puzzling, but something else had caught her attention. The house was quiet, but all the lights were on. The drapes were open, the front door was unlocked. Everything she had reminded the 5 children to do before they went to bed hadn't been done. Having assumed the children had merely forgotten, Jenny crawled back into bed. As Jenny was drifting to sleep, she heard something hit the roof and then roll down to the side of the house. And that's when she smelled smoke. At approximately 1:30 a.m. that morning, Jenny knew the house was on fire. She awoke George, she screamed for the children to get up, and when she made it to the hallway, smoke had engulfed the entire upstairs, and flames had already consumed the stairway leading to the children's bedrooms. Of course, George and Jenny kept yelling for everybody to get outside and meet them on the front yard. After they arrived on the yard and did a quick head count, they realized the 5 children that stayed up late that night weren't in the yard. Obviously, in a panic, George and Jenny realized that they probably were still in the house. George, of course, tried to run back inside to get his children, but the flames were just too strong. Because the flames were so high, he realized the only way to get the children is through a bedroom window. He raced around to the side of his house where he always left the ladder, and to his surprise, when he got there, it was gone. Of course, he panicked, but he sprung into action. He said, okay, I have 2 trucks over there. I can move them to the side of the house, and then I can climb up the window and get the children out safely. But when he got to his trucks, he soon realized neither of them would start. And what's even more strange is both trucks had been working perfectly fine the day before. Jenny and George quickly realized there was nothing they could do. Of course, the fire department was called, but nobody answered, and nobody from the fire department would come until 8 a.m. on Christmas Day. The fire chief alleges that he couldn't drive the fire truck to the fire, and nobody else was there to do it. And it was a holiday, so everybody was at home, which is why there was such a delay in getting to the Sodder home. Of course, local police and the fire department came to the home. They saw all the ash and the rubble, and they kind of picked their way through. And they said, the fire was hot, it cremated the children, and it was probably due to faulty wiring in the house. But George and Jenny were not having this explanation. They wanted to know how faulty wiring supposedly had caused this, when the wiring had been checked just last month, and several lights had been on during the fire. And although George and Jenny demanded the investigators look for more answers, it was a slow process. It's important to note that there were no actual human remains found in the fire, and nobody had smelled flesh burning, which apparently would happen if people were dying in a house fire. And when you sift through all those ashes, they still couldn't find any remains. No fragmented bones, no skeletal remains. Jenny would later talk to a cremator about the house fire, and he gave her an interesting fact. He said that it would take at least 2 hours and a much higher temperature to literally burn a human body into ash. But what's even more tantalizing is the Sodder home fire burned for less than an hour, which means there should have been 5 skeletal remains among those ashes. And so George and Jenny did what any parent would do. They opened their own investigation. They came across a bus driver who said he saw what looked like fireballs being thrown at the roof of the house, which would make sense because that's what awoke Jenny as she was falling back to sleep. She heard a thud on the roof and then something rolled down to the side of the house. And then a woman familiar with the family said that she had seen those 5 children in a car that she had never seen before, going by the house as the fire was ablaze. And then a waitress working at a diner 50 miles from the Sodder home, she said that she saw the 5 children and she served them breakfast, but she couldn't recall how many adults were with them. And then, of course, they kept spreading photos of the children, and they got another tip. A woman claims that she saw 4 of the children at a hotel in South Carolina, and they were in the company of 4 adults. I think it's important to note that the 5th child was missing. This only encouraged Jenny and George to continue their search for their children. Jenny even started to do experiments at home. She put chicken bones in the oven and burned them for 45 minutes straight to see if anything would be left of them. And of course, they were still intact. And George had heard of another home that burned down in the vicinity of theirs, and human remains were still intact. It was becoming clear that their children weren't in that fire. Of course, after getting all of this information, George and Jenny marched straight to the police department and handed it over to them. But police refused to look further into the investigation. They cited that the coroner's inquiry determined that no crime had been committed, which is odd because they didn't find any of the children's remains. So how do they know that no crime had been committed? This didn't deter Jenny and George. They worked harder to find their children. In fact, they were more determined than ever to find their 5 missing children. George would spend hours and hours shifting through the ruins of their home until he finally found his first clue. He found a few bones and what appeared to be some inner organs. And when tests came back, everybody was shocked. The organ he found was a cow's liver, and the bones he had come across, although they were human remains, the remains belonged to somebody significantly older than the 5 children, and the bones showed no sign of damage by the fire. It would appear somebody may have planted those organs and bones after the fire had destroyed the home and cooled off. Next, George and Jenny erected a billboard near the site of their former home. They announced a $10,000 award for the safe return of their children, and they believed they were alive and had been kidnapped. And the fire was set to deliberately cover the abductors' tracks. And then in 1968, 23 years after the fire, an envelope came in the mail for Jenny. There was no return address on it, but she did notice that it was sent from Kentucky. And when she opened the envelope, she was shocked. Inside was a photograph of a young man. And on the back, there was something written. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, and then some numbers written. Authorities, of course, thought it was some cruel joke being played on the Sodder family, but Jenny and George really thought this could be Louis. They felt like that would be exactly what he looked like had he survived and all this time had gone by. Because investigators weren't doing anything about this, they hired a private investigator who went off to Kentucky to find the person that sent this picture. And he was never heard from again. The 1968 photo would be the last evidence ever received in the missing case of the 5 Sodder children. George died in 1969, a year after the photo, and Jenny would die 20 years later. And they firmly believed that their children never died in that fire. So this case has so many elements to it and so many unanswered questions. Who was that woman who called in the middle of the night right before the fire started? Why did she call? Who was throwing those quote-unquote fireballs at the Sodder family home? How did they get 5 children out of the house undetected? And of course, who's the young man in this photo and who sent it? And then the private investigator just disappears. Nobody ever hears from him again. What happened to him? Did he actually find out the truth? Or did he just take the money for the job and disappear? And who put the cow liver and bones at the site of the house fire? Obviously, they were trying to deceive George and Jenny, who were far too smart to fall for it. But somebody did that. But what bothers me the most is if these children were abducted, how were they abducted? Their eldest sister was asleep on the sofa downstairs, and Jenny and George were less than 20 feet away in their own bedroom. I mean, the children were told to take care of the farm animals, so it is plausible that the boys went out to take care of the farm animals and then 3 girls went to watch, and they were all abducted outside. But that seems too easy. So I guess we're just left with a lot of questions and really no answers. But that's it for today, guys. Thanks for joining me. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. See you later.